Hello everybody, and welcome back to Cam Critiques. 2022 has just come to a close, and it was a year packed with great releases. So today, I'll be going through the best of the best, ranking the 10 games I most enjoyed. Before I dive into the list, I want to highlight some honorable mentions. Vampire Survivors, Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, Sonic Frontiers, and Rogue Legacy 2 are all games that just barely missed the list, and I'd highly recommend them. There are also a couple remakes that I opted not to include so I could highlight all new content, specifically Live Alive and Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, as well as a few games I've yet to try that could have made the list, such as Spark the Electric Jester 3, Sifu, and Harvestella. When I get to those titles, my list may change a bit. I'm still kicking myself for not getting to No More Heroes 3 in time for last year's list. But regardless, I'm very happy with the list I have right now. All of these games are top notch. So, let's just jump right into the list and start with number 10. Number 10. Splatoon 3. If Splatoon 2 didn't exist, or wasn't a Switch game, I can almost guarantee that Splatoon 3 would be significantly higher. My main problem with this title is simply that it's insanely derivative. It has no new modes, a very small handful of new weapons, and without years of post-launch support, it currently has much less content than its predecessor. I could totally understand why a Splatoon fan would skip this game. Still, after playing it, I can't deny that there were some smart changes, and this is definitely the best Splatoon game to date. The most noteworthy change is definitely seen in the hub area. It's vastly expanded and takes on a whole new aesthetic from that of the first two. There were also lots of nice small additions to mess around with, such as lockers to design and showcase, and a whole card-based side game. All of these changes are pretty superfluous. They don't really affect the core content of the game at all, but they do make the sequel feel a little more fresh. The core gameplay isn't entirely devoid of change though. In particular, two tweaks stand out to me. First, they added a squid roll, which lets you do a small jump backwards out of ink, allowing for slightly improved maneuverability and greatly improved dodging. But most importantly, they finally added a lobby system. It's somewhat primitive, but at least it's finally easy to play this game with your friends. The highlight of this game for me was the campaign. In terms of structure, it's very derivative of Splatoon 2's Octo expansion, but it does have an entirely fresh aesthetic, lots of great levels, an enjoyable story, and some great set pieces. It's definitely a lot better than the base campaigns of the first two Splatoon titles, and I had a blast going for 100%. At the end of the day, Splatoon 3 isn't a game that needed to exist on Switch. If you want to engage with the same core gameplay in all the same modes, Splatoon 2 is right there on the same console. But this is still the best Splatoon game to date, and Splatoon is a great franchise. I got a lot of enjoyment out of this title, and especially because of Splatoon 3's great campaign, I'm glad they did more than just further update Splatoon 2. Now, let's move on to number 9. Number 9. God of War Ragnarok. I have never been a huge fan of the God of War series. In its earlier incarnations, it was an action game that lacked any real depth in its combat and was overly edgy, to the point that it came across as cynical. And then, when the series got its 2018 reboot, it felt like it was pretty blatantly ripping off The Last of Us, child companion and all. I enjoyed God of War 2018 when it came out more than I expected. The combat was great for the kind of cinematic third-person adventure game it is, and the aesthetic ended up being more distinct than I expected. It also dropped the series' cynicism, and actually utilized that earlier cynicism as a plot device. But I still had some issues with it. In particular, I thought the story had some pretty rough, unnatural character arcs for some of its most central players, and I thought the enemies lacked variety. Luckily, God of War Ragnarok is better in just about every way. The gameplay is very similar at its core between the two most recent God of War entries, but Ragnarok gives you a lot more combat options with an extra weapon right at the start and a vastly increased amount of variety in both enemies and areas. You can finally visit all the 9 realms of Norse mythology, and they're mostly expansive and all distinct. The expansive environments also allow for better exploration. One thing that really stands out in this game is how great all the side content is. It's practically indistinguishable from the main content. The majority of this game's dungeons carried by unique aesthetics, puzzles, and enemies, are entirely optional, which lets this game have both an expansive world that's enjoyable to explore and a tight linear narrative. Speaking of, the narrative is pretty interesting, and a lot of the voice actors deliver some excellent performances. As with God of War 2018, some character arcs feel very rushed, which is a bit distracting, especially in a game so focused on its story. But at least it doesn't affect one of the two main characters this time around. Ultimately, God of War Ragnarok is a fun action game that tells an interesting story. It's packed with things to do, and as expected for a AAA PS5 game, it's absolutely gorgeous. This game has its problems, but among the slew of cinematic third-person action-adventure games Sony has been putting out over the last decade, this stands out as one of the best. Now, on to number 8. Number 8. Pokemon Legends Arceus. Throughout most of the Switch's life, Pokemon had started to lose its grip on me. I was a big fan of the series for practically my entire life, but after Sword and Shield came out, I had very little interest in future games. So I'll readily admit that I think a lot of my enjoyment of this game comes from the fact that Game Freak tried to do literally anything new at all. But I do still believe this game is a great title at its core, not just for what it represents for the Pokemon franchise. This game has a super addictive gameplay loop, driven by streamlined Pokemon capturing. Instead of having to engage in battle to capture each and every creature, you can just throw a Pokeball in the overworld. Where the ball hits a Pokemon impacts capture chance, so the act of capturing isn't totally mindless. You're also rewarded for capturing multiple of every species, with each of the first 10 captures giving you more info in your Pokédex. So there's always something to catch, even if you only see repeat creatures. I had a blast sneaking around this game's different environments, observing and capturing hundreds of Pokemon and finding neat new landmarks and items along the way. This game has exploration far better than all prior Pokemon titles. Areas are vast and open, and you can ride a variety of Pokemon to get around them in a variety of ways. I always loved finding little caves or alcoves. They can house not only rare items, but even unique Pokemon. Finding a neat treasure when you go off the beaten path is fun enough in any game, but finding a new party member is all the more exhilarating. The combat is even vastly improved, at least from my perspective as someone who prefers Pokemon for its campaign. Boss fights implement action mechanics such as throwing and dodging as your trainer. Animations and notifications of things like status effects imparted or experience gained are greatly sped up, and you can even put your Pokemon in speed or power focus modes, adding another layer of that without slowing things down in battle. The world of Legends Arceus can feel a little empty, and the visuals and performance are pretty bad. But, unlike the other Pokemon games released this year, this game runs at a level that is, by any metric, acceptable, and the actual gameplay loop is incredibly fun and addicting. It has its issues, but this game gave me the most fun I've had with a Pokemon title in a long time. Now, let's move on to number 7. Number 7. Triangle Strategy. Square Enix is probably the most hit-or-miss company on the market right now. I absolutely adore many of their games, new and old, but they also put out some of the most depressing, cynical games you can find. The very same month Triangle Strategy dropped, so did the microtransaction-riddled Chocobo GP and the, well, frankly every issue imaginable riddled Babylon's Fall. So, when a game with a title like Triangle Strategy from a company like Square releases, I totally understand why anyone might want to avoid it. But this game is one of the best tactical RPGs I've played in a long time, and it's a very impressive, gorgeous title that left me pleasantly surprised. Triangle Strategy is named Triangle Strategy as the game is built around 3 warring countries with vastly different ideologies and tactics. The conflict at the core of this game could technically be described as a triangle of different strategies. But the reason this element is emphasized so much as to be the basis of this game's title is because of the sheer amount of player choice you're given in how you interact with this triangle. You can essentially choose which side you ally with on a per chapter basis. This game has a ton of different choices to make, and they totally alter the story you view, the battles you fight, and the characters you fight with. It's honestly really impressive how many branching paths the developer considered, and how different each path can be. It helps to make the game very replayable. But simply having branching paths wouldn't mean much if the stories were all uninteresting. Luckily, this game's narrative is super enthralling. The world itself is pretty generic, and all of your allies are pretty shallow, but this game excels at telling a story driven by politics. An impressive amount of that was put into realizing the complex politics of an entire continent, and the choices feel all the more interesting because of how they drive the development of said politics. I always felt like my choices carried a lot of weight, and I was always excited to see how they'd impact the political dynamics between the three countries at this game's core. Beyond the plot though, this game has some truly excellent tactical combat. It's pretty par for the course for this genre, but there are a ton of unique units with some really out there gimmicks and an astounding amount of unique maps. I wish the character building was a little more involved, but each battle felt pretty wildly different, so I was still more than fun enough to strategize around each chapter. Triangle strategy may have shallow party members and weak character building, but it's still an excellent RPG with a great aesthetic, utilizing Square's recent HD 2D art style to make something that looks more like a PlayStation 1 game, an enthralling story, and a really fun, varied combat. It's one of the best RPGs I've played this year. Now, on to number 6. Number 6. Bayonetta 3. I absolutely adore the Bayonetta series. I've been a huge fan since the very beginning, but in recent years my opinion of Platinum games has been starting to slip. I love Nier Automata, but not necessarily for its combat, and I've either disliked or hated pretty much everything else they've put out since Bayonetta 2. Their Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game is truly embarrassing, as is this year's Babylon Fall. So I didn't exactly go into Bayonetta 3 with the highest of expectations. This was pretty much the last chance I was going to give Platinum. If it was bad, I was going to give up on following their games at all. And it does have some disappointing elements. But at its core, this is a fantastic action game. It's easily the best Platinum title since Bayonetta 2. The main issue I have with this game is its story. I won't go too in depth as to avoid spoilers, but I've never seen such a brutal character assassination. The plot is confusing, the ending is insulting, and the tone is all around for Bayonetta. Way too many people dramatically die here. I enjoyed some interactions between this game's characters. I especially like seeing the new playable character Viola interact with Bayonetta, but as a whole, the story is awful, and it's pretty much the only reason this game isn't closer to the top of my list. Luckily, the story is, at least for me, pretty easy to look past when the combat is so excellent. It's fast, it's deep, it's cinematic, it's varied, it has it all. You can pull off crazy combos like you could in Bayonetta 1, and it looks and feels better than ever. The new Demon Slave mechanic, allowing you to control kaijus mid-battle, feels awesome, and there are tons of set-piece driven moments to take on new fun gameplay styles. Not all of the gameplay is top-notch. Sometimes you have to play as Viola, who just feels much worse than Bayonetta, and there are even some weird 2D stealth sections where you play as Jean. But most of the time you're Bayonetta, and when you're Bayonetta, you're engaging with what may be the best combat system the gaming has seen yet. One thing that really stood out to me about this game in contrast to its contemporaries, such as the excellent Devil May Cry 5, is that it actually had levels that were fun to explore and super varied. Most action game levels are hallways with enemies for you to fight, but Bayonetta 3 pulls off the perfect balance, letting you primarily focus on the great combat but also giving you some downtime to explore some nice environments. So, while Bayonetta 3 has some truly noteworthy problems, it also excels in a lot of ways. It really is close to being the best action game I've ever played. I wish I could put it higher, but its story has haunted me for months now. Still, I'm excited to see where Platinum goes next, and I'm glad to see the company return to form. Now, let's move on to number 5. Number 5. Neon White. Neon White is pretty hard to describe. It's a cross between an FPS, a card game, a platformer, and a visual novel. But it's a platformer first and foremost, and it's one of the best feeling games I've played this year. The bulk of this game's gameplay is speedrun focused stages where you have to jump around, kill a variety of demons, and reach the end. You're rewarded for getting fast times, the core gameplay feels great, and levels are the perfect length, so I found myself replaying each one multiple times before moving on to the next. Conquering a level here is just so satisfying. This game uses cards as its weapons, but that's pretty much purely aesthetic. In reality, the cards are basically ammo for traditional weapons. This game gets pretty demanding. There's some intense, fast-paced platforming and precise shooting, and having to manage your ammo very carefully only adds to that intensity. but with every individual level being so short, mastering them feels feasible. By the end of this game, I felt like a god, fitting since it takes place in heaven. This game's aesthetic is great. It's super stylish with a nice techno soundtrack, tons of cool art, and lots of fun writing. The concept alone is really neat. You're a sinner plucked from hell and sent to heaven to exterminate demons, and the game fully delivers on it. This game is a joy to play and look at. It's also a joy to read. When you're not platforming, you're bonding with some other key characters in visual novel sections that offer some great dialogue. Some of the dialogue leans a little too hard into the aesthetic to the point of being cringy, and there is some minor grammatical issues, but most of it is spot on. It's a nice change of pace from the platforming, and it fleshes out the narrative nicely. Ultimately, Neon White has both style and substance on levels far greater than the average game. This game put me in a flow state like no other this year, and while I had some issues with its writing, I mostly had a blast getting to know the titular Neon White's friends. This is the most I've enjoyed an indie game in quite a while, and it easily could have been number 1 in a worse year. But we still have 4 games that are even better. So let's move right on to number 4. Number 4. Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Xenoblade has quickly risen to be one of the best RPG franchises on the market in my opinion, and this is probably the best one yet. Xenoblade 3 is an expansive, gorgeous world packed with landmarks and treasures, making it a blast to explore. It has fun, fast-paced combat with a lot of depth, and it has the best cast the series has seen by a significant margin. I have a few minor issues, but I love this game at the end of the day. The highlight of Xenoblade 3 is definitely its world. The concept itself, which I can't describe in detail without massively spoiling this game's great story, is enthralling. It's a mysterious combination of the worlds of Xenoblade 1 and 2. Still, areas feel distinct and they look gorgeous. Far better than the other Xenoblades on Switch, at least from a technical perspective. In those other games, exploration often felt like a chore, either due to slow movement or frustrating skill checks. But in 3, I found myself wandering into every area I could. Doing so was rewarding both visually and more tangibly with the great items and even party members and classes you could find. This is some of the most fun I've had exploring on Switch since I played Breath of the Wild all the way back at the console's launch. The combat is also excellent. While it can be a little difficult to fully comprehend what's happening, and the chain attack system gets old fast with how time consuming each chain attack is, it's a lot more engaging than combat in the other games in the series, largely because you can control 6 characters in one battle instead of just 1. You can basically always be using a skill, and with the impact positioning can have and the different combos you can pull off, there's a lot to think about. It's hard to have a great RPG without a great story. Xenoblade X on the Wii U is one of the few exceptions I can think of, but this game does not face that problem. It tells one of the more interesting stories the series has seen to date. It's a little more allegorical than the other 2 Xenoblades on Switch, and it feels far less sci-fi focused, which was a bit disappointing to me as a fan of the Xeno series as a whole. But that's not to say the storytelling isn't great, it's just different. And it still rises above its siblings because of the fantastic party. For the first time in the series, there are no nothing characters like Sharla or obnoxious morally dubious characters like Tora. Every character is well realized, they all have interesting development, and their chemistry as a party is fantastic. Ultimately, Xenoblade 3 is an RPG that has it all. It has great characters, great combat, great exploration, and a great story. If you like JRPGs, this is a must-play. It's probably the best Switch exclusive RPG out there. But there are still a few games that are even better from 2022. So, let's move right on to number 3. Number 3. Kirby and the Forgotten Land. I've always enjoyed the Kirby franchise, but I never would have expected a Kirby game would come out that could place higher on this sort of list than the likes of Bayonetta 3, Neon White, and Xenoblade 3. However, Kirby and the Forgotten Land is a huge leap forward for the franchise, and it's one of the best 3D platformers I've played in a long time. In contrast to the Switch's other mainline Kirby game, Star Allies, which feels very sterile, Forgotten Land feels super creative and fresh. It takes place in an entirely new dimension for Kirby, and its levels are packed with nice visual touches and clever cohesion that make this world feel like, well, a world, not just a series of platforming levels. I said this in my last video too, but it really does remind me of Donkey Kong Country in that regard. The levels don't just look nice, of course. They also feel great to traverse. Kirby doesn't have a ton of copy abilities, but the ones that are here feel great to control. Kirby's base moveset is also expanded, with him even having a Bayonetta-esque perfect dodge that slows down time. And the new mouthful mode gimmick adds even more unique abilities to utilize. No matter what ability or comically large object you have at your disposal, this game is super responsive, and it just always feels really satisfying to platform or fight. This game is just delightful through and through. It's gorgeous, charming, creative, and it feels super responsive. I have no huge complaints. It doesn't have the most flexible movement system, it doesn't have the deepest combat, but it does have some of the most polished, pleasant gameplay of the year. This game just makes me really happy, and I'd highly recommend it to anybody of any age. Now, on to number 2. Number 2, AI The Somnium Files, Nirvana Initiative. I'm frankly not going to be able to say a lot about why this game is so high on my list. This is a visual novel, and some unremarkable puzzles are the only gameplay there is to speak of. I can tell you that this game has an excellent cast and sense of humor, much like the first AI. I can also tell you that this game has a twist that is so mind-blowing, so insane, and so well executed that it left my jaw on the floor for hours. This game is a mystery that's a blast to unravel, and the payoff couldn't be greater. But I refuse to spoil this excellent game for anyone watching. So, just trust me and go play it. And while you're at it, play its predecessor too. But before we leave to go do that, this video still has one more game to talk about. My game of the year is number 1, Elden Ring. Elden Ring is a pretty magical game. It's unlike anything else, not because it brings any crazy new ideas to the table, but because it does something that's practically inconceivable. It crafts a massive open world that has the quality of the best Dark Souls zones throughout its entirety. Its combat is nothing revolutionary. It's basically just Dark Souls 3 combat. Its bosses are great, but not particularly better than those of any other Soulsborne game. Its story is interesting, but it's pretty par for the course for a Hidetaka Miyazaki game. This game stands out so much because it's just so fun to explore, more fun than any other open world game I've ever played. Every square inch of the many square miles that make up its map is polished and content rich. This game just has so much in it, and it's all designed so well. It really does pull off the immersive, interconnected level design that Soulsborne games are widely praised for on a scale that I didn't imagine possible, and it's incredible. This game sucked me in like no other this year, and it basically redefined my standards for a top-notch open world game. I already know I'll be thinking about it and revisiting this title for years to come. Going into 2023, Tears of the Kingdom is going to have a really tough time topping this. And that brings us to the end of my list. 2022 was a great year for games, one of the best in a long time. But with titles like the new Zelda and Final Fantasy XVI on the horizon, 2023 has the potential to be even better. Let me know what your favorite games of 2022 were in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. You should also consider checking out my other content. This is my recently updated ranking of just about every single first-party game available on the Nintendo Switch. Thank you all for watching, and have a great rest of your day.